Hi everybody, a very warm welcome to my channel, Nelly the Narcissist. Thank you so much for joining today. To all of my subscribers, thanks so much for your support. And for anybody new, no, I am not a narcissist, but Nelly is the character that I portray in my comedy skits. If you haven't seen those, they're healing medicine for all survivors of narcissists and also to raise awareness about this type of misunderstood abuse. All links below in the video description. So in today's episode, I'm going to be discussing a very uncomfortable topic that's recently come to my attention through a direct experience that I've had whilst caring for a friend of mine who's just had some major surgery. And what I saw and what I encountered inside a hospital was pure horror. Now, I've heard of other stories from survivors of narcissistic abuse along the same lines, which is exactly why I've chosen to make this video, to expose it and get it out there in the light of day. Now, we tend to view hospitals and care facilities as places of healing, obviously, places that are filled with kind and compassionate people. And of course, there are plenty of people like that that work in those facilities. Most of the time, that's exactly what we encounter. The majority of people who choose that kind of work, they do it because they do genuinely want to help. And they've got good intentions. There are some absolutely amazing individuals that are working with a lot of love. And when you receive such beautiful care, you sometimes feel like you've been touched by the divine. We must never ever forget that side. But there is the flip side of the coin. And it's the side that nobody expects to find in such environments of health and care, because it's so counterintuitive. It's totally hidden behind uniforms and credentials and trust. So every so often we hear about these extreme cases that make the news. You know, it's a staff who commits horrific acts and eventually gets caught. But what about all of those other ones who don't cross any obvious line? What about the ones who keep their abuse so subtle and quiet that it goes underneath the radar? And this actually makes them a lot more dangerous to people. Dark personalities are drawn to anywhere where there's vulnerability, anywhere where they have trust, and anywhere that there is unequal power, anywhere also that there's no witnesses. And this conversation was sparked, obviously, like I said, by something that I recently witnessed inside a hospital whilst caring for a friend after major surgery. And what actually happened opened my eyes even more than before to the reality that dark personalities, they can and they do infiltrate positions that should be defined by compassion only. But like I said, where there is vulnerability and responsibility and trust and power, the potential always exists for the misuse of power. And those with darker personalities can use these settings as incredible camouflage, where they can get away with practically anything, just as long as they're careful enough to not get caught. Or if they're overt, they may just have so much power within the institution that they're never opposed. And the most chilling thing of all is that institutions have got massive blind spots because they can't understand why a narcissistic, sadistic, or psychopathic person would choose a care profession. But they absolutely do. And they do it far more than often people realize. There are individuals with these dark personalities. I'm talking about those with the dark tetrad, narcissism, psychopathy, and Machiavellianism. This is the core of the triad. But then it was understood that if somebody has got all of those, then they almost certainly always have sadism too. And these individuals are actually drawn to positions of care and medicine, obviously for very different reasons that I'm going to discuss today. And I'm focusing on hospitals in this video, but this applies absolutely anywhere that there's vulnerable life, whether it's elderly care homes or facilities for children or even animal shelters. And if you have been affected by the topic of today's video, or if you know of somebody that has, then please do share your experience in the comments below and let's see how big this really is. And just before we start, please do help me get this subject circulating and get more exposure by liking the video, share it with anybody that you think would benefit from hearing it, and subscribe to the channel if you're not. I'd like to share part of my recent experience with a nurse inside a hospital, although I want to speak just, briefly to open this subject up to a wider discussion, because this isn't an isolated incident. This happens in many places all around the world every single day. So very recently, like I said, I was helping a close friend of mine who needed some major surgery, and I went with them to the hospital and I stayed during the recovery. But during the daytime, we were in there just for one night. During the daytime, all of the nurses were lovely. They were warm and attentive. They were absolutely everything that you would expect in a caregiver. But then the staff switched to the night shift. And when that happened, everything changed. So there were only actually 2 nurses that were responsible for the entire ward, and each patient was in a private room during the night. There was one that was completely beautiful, angelic, loving and kind. But on the flip, the other nurse that was assigned to the ward was the stark contrast. And I'm not discussing somebody that just didn't like their job or was a little bit rough or impatient. I'm speaking about this because it was clear that this was a dark personality that was using their position to cause pain intentionally and enjoy it. And if you've ever been around a malignant narcissist or a sadistic personality, you know this feeling that you get when they enter the room or when you're around them. It's an instinct, it's energetic, and your body senses it way before your mind can rationalize it. And once you've been closely connected to somebody like that, you have a radar for picking up on it again. And when this particular nurse walked in the room, the behavior was immediately alarming, because every single movement was violent in a way that was completely abnormal and inappropriate for somebody who's just woken up from major surgery and could barely open their eyes. This nurse, she didn't just lack care, she seemed to enjoy causing pain and discomfort. From the surgery, my friend was really in a vulnerable position, and I wasn't even speaking the language there. So I was feeling also a bit vulnerable and powerless. I didn't know whether what I was saying was usual in that country, but I felt on edge when that nurse came into the room. I instinctively felt a defense against her and a hypervigilance. I felt something was really bad. And then I saw her slap something on my friend's face with no care, with a lot of violence, and she quickly pressed with force one of my friend's eyes where the surgery had just been made, and I heard my friend cry out. Now keep in mind, my friend couldn't really open her eyes and she couldn't see very well, but she could feel the energy. And when the nurse went out, she started having a panic attack. And I had already decided before even that incident that there was no way that I was going to leave her alone that night. And she was panicking that I would. She was terrified to be left alone with that kind of person. And I did want to make a very big drama. And if we were talking the same language, then believe me, I would have made my feelings very well known to her. But my friend did not want me making any kind of trouble while she was in that vulnerable state. And there was nobody to speak English with. It was an absolute hell. So instead, any time that my friend needed help, instead of pressing the button, I hovered around the doorway, waiting for an opportunity to actually capture the attention of the nice nurse without raising any kinds of suspicions from the other one. And it was a really awful and unbelievable experience. And before anybody asks, we did make a formal complaint, and I only hope that that institution takes it very seriously. But the point of sharing this is not about this specific nurse. It's about the pattern. It's about the psychology and the energy that's behind these behaviors that survivors of narcissistic abuse, we recognize instantly. And that brings us really into the main core of today's episode, which is discussing the psychology of this type of dark personality. To understand why certain individuals end up in positions of care, we need to really talk about something in psychology that is called the dark tetrad. So the first is narcissism, and we all know hopefully what that is, which is entitlement, superiority, a lack of complete empathy, and a need for continuous admiration. That's like the most simple terms. Then there is psychopathy, which is a shallowness, a coldness, impulsivity. It's a thrill-seeking, and it's a lack of guilt. There's also Machiavellianism, which is a strategic cruelty, manipulation, calculated behavior. and their sadism, which is the enjoyment of causing pain and discomfort or humiliation to others. And these traits, they don't always appear together, but when they do, you get a personality that is not only devoid of empathy, but is actively drawn to situations where harm can be inflicted without consequences. Now, here is something that people rarely understand. In psychology, one of the biggest misconceptions is that abusers seek obvious positions of dominance. Because in reality, many seek positions of trust, because trust becomes their camouflage. Hospitals are actually perfect environments for this personality, because patients are very, very vulnerable. Patients are also medicated. Patients, they can't defend themselves properly. And patients are taught to comply, and they're told to be grateful. So institutions, they assume goodness, and the uniforms, they command authority, and staff usually work unsupervised, especially during night shifts. So if you look at all this, this is an irresistible playground for somebody who enjoys dominance and has no empathy. And whilst most healthcare workers are beautiful souls, like I said, it only takes one personality, one dark personality, to change everything. So let's talk about how these kinds of individuals hide. They're very, very clever, because these individuals are often very charming, polite, and even softly spoken, because they craft what psychologists are going to call the mask of virtue. They create a persona that's appearing, caring, and kind, and competent, and moral, and even gentle. This mask, it hides them, and it's very hard to detect, and it's even harder to believe when somebody then reports them. To their colleagues, they might look very efficient and competent and professional. I know that this nurse in the ward, she was very friendly with the daytime nurses when they came in. But to vulnerable patients, their mask slips and the real personality can emerge. And in our situation, my friend told me that this nurse that we dealt with, she spoke very sweetly in her words, but her energy couldn't mask her sadistic intentions. And these institutions, you see, when they hire people, they're looking for competence, not conscience. They can easily evaluate somebody's skills, but they can't easily evaluate if somebody has empathy, because that can be faked very well. It's very easy. If you have been through narcissistic abuse, usually your intuition becomes razor sharp, because you notice the things that most people would overlook completely. Your nervous system has learned to scan for danger. And that's why many abuse survivors can sense a dark presence much faster than anybody else can, particularly institutions. Now, I want to speak about something that dark personalities especially love, and it's asymmetrical power. And what that means is you lying down whilst they can stand up. You know, it's you being highly medicated whilst they're completely sober. It's you being in pain whilst they're fully functional, because you depend on them and they remain completely indifferent. Because for these sadistic types, for these dark personalities, power is only really satisfying when it's completely uneven and obviously tipped into their favor. And institutions are not trained to see this type of personality, because they hire based on credentials and merit, not on empathy. And they assume that everybody is in those care roles because they're kind. They believe in the mask. They don't understand that people do wear masks. And patients are often too weak or medicated to raise their concerns. My friend was too stressed and exhausted after her surgery. She did not want to create a scene. And she was scared as well, because she was in such a vulnerable state. This is how these kinds of dark personalities are able to continue what they do and to thrive. Healthcare systems are built on the assumption that people choose these kinds of professions for benevolent reasons. The idea that somebody would actually enter nursing or caregiving in order to hurt people is so unthinkable that people simply can't process that as a possibility. And this creates the perfect hiding place for a dark personality, because they got constant access to the vulnerable and they've got full authority. They're in a position of high trust. They're not supervised. There's zero witnesses. and they have this moral image that completely offers them this perfect protection. It's perfect for them. And when you've met even one of these personalities, you understand immediately what I'm talking about. You know it, you can feel it. So I want to offer some practical guidelines on how we could protect ourselves or those that we care about the most in these kinds of situations. Always trust your intuition immediately. Now, if something feels off, if it feels wrong, if it feels dangerous, it probably is. Your intuition, it exists always to protect you. And survivors of abuse, like I said, they pick up on danger faster usually than anybody else. Never leave a vulnerable person alone if something feels wrong. Always stay with them. Stay awake, stay vigilant. Just having your presence can deter harmful behavior. Now, I was shocked in disbelief that this particular nurse that I dealt with, she did not care that I was in the room. She was showing herself. What I imagine is that she did not feel threatened in the slightest because I wasn't speaking their language. And so she probably felt like she could get away with it. But being there, I was able to manage the situation and to prevent any further harm from happening. I was a watcher, and more importantly, I was going to be a witness. But the other piece of advice that I say is document absolutely everything. Write down the times, the dates, the staff names, if visible, or get the names. Write down what was said, how the patient responded, what they did. This is all vital for creating an account that you can actually submit. And ask to speak to somebody in charge or a supervisor of the ward. Don't confront the staff member directly. I was going to do that, but no, don't. Keep your calm and keep factual. This is the important part. You can always ask for a staff reassignment. You are absolutely allowed to do that. You don't need to explain anything. You really don't. Hospitals are required to honour the request if it involves patient comfort or safety. Keep somebody with you overnight if you feel unsafe, or if anybody feels unsafe, stay with the person. I know that hospitals don't always expect people to stay overnight, but if somebody that you're with feels unsafe, or if you feel unsafe, you can absolutely request that somebody stays with you. If anybody is worried for somebody that's unable to speak for themselves, then stay by their side. Don't leave them. Dark personalities, they target sedated patients, the elderly, people with disabilities, children, people who don't speak the language, anybody that is disorientated or scared. And usually your presence offers some kind of protection. Never second guess the signs of cruelty. Your instinct and your intuition, you trust it. If somebody's dismissive or sarcastic or degrading or forceful, these aren't small things, they're big red flags. They absolutely do need to be reported. And I wanted to kick up a huge fuss that night, and I would have barricaded the door not to let that nurse in. But it was not my friend's wish. She didn't want to create such a big problem there. So I found out this nurse's name discreetly so we could later report her, and we made a complaint after to the senior manager of that hospital. And by the way, that manager was really shocked. It was not expected of that nurse, which tells me that the mask is operating very well. The experience that I had in that hospital, it really shook me. But it also opened my eyes to the wider reality that dark personalities can be anywhere, even in the places that we trust the most. So if you've enjoyed this video today, please do help me get this message out to more people by liking, sharing, subscribing if you haven't, and do comment your thoughts down below if you've had a similar experience that you'd like to share. For now, thank you so much for watching. Take care, sending love, and I will see you all again next time.